Many people cherish the chance to love. Yet the fair-haired man held an entirely different view on the matter. For him, excessive attachment to another had become a sin. One day, it shattered his entire life, and to this day he suffered from its aftermath. It frustrated him, for no one could stay by his side long enough to build any sort of romantic relationship. This was his eternal curse. The protagonist felt equally doomed as he ran along the highway, hoping not to be caught by his pursuer, striving to distance himself from his own apartment, whose location had been discovered by the gangster tormenting him. But as soon as he crossed the threshold, the villain immediately pinned him to the floor, intent on committing unspeakable acts that would scar him for life. Hajin tried to defend himself, but unfortunately, the situation was far from favorable for such resistance, leaving him almost no chance. Nevertheless, he was determined to escape by any means necessary, so he reached for the lamp on the nightstand beside him, intending to strike his adversary with it. In the end, a single well-placed blow was enough to knock the enemy unconscious on the bed, blood seeping from his head, leaving room for the possibility of his death. And so now the protagonist ran along the night road, trying not to dwell on what had just transpired. Was it worse for his foe to survive this encounter or to have perished? Fleeing from the incident, Hajin found himself on a high automobile bridge spanning a river. He sought a solution that would help him escape the relentless pursuit, but no way out seemed to present itself, plunging him into deep despair. Suddenly, he realized he could end this nightmare alongside his life. Climbing the tall railing, he clung to a nearby post, preparing to leap into the river, when a motorcycle pulled up behind him. The rider observed the scene for several moments without intervening. Eventually, however, he addressed the would-be sinner, inquiring about the dangerous act he intended, warning it was a poor choice in any situation. Moreover, he even commanded the protagonist to descend, startling him greatly. This sudden appearance nearly caused Hajin to fall by accident. Yet, managing to regain his balance, he tried to discern the identity of his interlocutor, fearing it might be another pursuer. The fair-haired man, however, refused to say anything until the boy stepped down. He usually did not meddle in such affairs, but this time he couldn't stay indifferent, even though he had no family to mourn his loss. Still, the conversation with the stranger distracted Hajin from his grim thoughts. Moreover, the man promised to listen, offering Hajin a chance to share his feelings. Thus, the protagonist decided to heed this strange man's words, for he didn't seem dangerous, nor did he resemble a pursuer. But in his attempt to descend from the high railing, the boy lost his balance, plunging downwards, rapidly approaching the deep river below. At that moment, he regretted ever climbing the bridge, and wishing he hadn't tried to jump. He no longer wanted to die, not like this, not on this day. The fair-haired man, realizing his fears were justified, now had to save the one who had intended to end it all, and so he leapt after him. Unexpectedly, wings appeared on the stranger's back, shocking Hajin, who had never seen such a phenomenon in anyone before. The angel grasped the falling boy by the hand, halting his descent toward death. To lift the protagonist back up, the man pulled him close, allowing Hajin to finally feel some semblance of safety, though his body still trembled. The strange man realized once again how much trouble humans caused him. As soon as they were back on the bridge, Kael released the rescued boy. But instead of gratitude, Hajin grew angry, shoving him by the shoulders, demanding to know what kind of creature he was. Such a reaction astonished the man. He had expected something quite different. However, the protagonist remarked that he hadn't asked to be saved and had chosen to die himself. But the winged man knew the boy was truly afraid of death. Now, in gratitude for the rescue, Kael asked for a single favor, a rather unusual one. He requested a kiss, which greatly surprised the boy. In the end, without waiting for permission, he kissed Hajin himself, not allowing him to refuse. Though the protagonist did not resist, he realized something was deeply wrong with this strange man. He seemed just as dangerous as the one who had been chasing him. Moreover, as soon as this odd encounter ended, the man suggested they do it again, as if such behavior were completely normal, despite the briefness of their acquaintance. But this time, the protagonist wasn't so quick to yield. Expecting what might come, he simply turned his head away, refusing to let the stranger near his face. In the end, to protect himself from the unnervingly persistent stranger, he slapped him across the cheek, leaving a visible mark from his hand. Such defiance was something the arrogant man clearly hadn't anticipated. He even voiced his indignation, despite the fact that Hajin was merely trying to defend his personal boundaries. Suddenly, Kael seized the boy's face, squeezing his cheeks, his demeanor growing increasingly aggressive, and it was unclear what he might do next. For a while, they locked eyes, the protagonist's fear mounting as he hadn't expected such a reaction, especially from someone who had just risked his life to save him. The fair-haired man was equally bewildered, clearly expecting a certain response, one that, much to his disappointment, he hadn't received, even after the unsolicited kiss. It now became clear how bizarre his actions must have appeared, prompting the winged man to release the boy, realizing how much he must have frightened him. Stepping back, he indicated that he wouldn't touch the one he had promised to help and listen to, though in reality, he had only given the boy more reason to jump off the bridge. The protagonist immediately covered his face with his hand and stepped away from the dangerous man, unable to understand his motives. If he wanted to hurt him, why save him at all? Nevertheless, he wasn't intent on escalating the conflict, knowing that, after all, he was still alive thanks to this man. He simply asked him to leave at once. Kael walked over to his motorcycle, but made it clear that by refusing further contact, the boy was losing something significant. Despite everything that had transpired between them, the protagonist couldn't let his savior leave without expressing his gratitude for such a brave act. Now convinced that this wouldn't be their last meeting, the fair-haired man rode off, promising they would see each other again soon, a notion both strange and somewhat illogical. Hajin, confused, watched the departing motorcycle for a long time, still unable to determine whether something good or bad had just happened to him. His thoughts were abruptly interrupted by the unexpected but fortunate ringing of his phone. It wasn't safe to return home. It was his best friend, Shin Woo, calling. The one person who could help him in this difficult situation, given how close they were and how freely they could discuss such matters. Hajin decided that his only option now was to ask his friend if he could spend the night at his place until things became clearer. His friend welcomed him warmly, making sure to show that it was no inconvenience at all to have him as a guest. Shin Woo's primary concern, however, was the visible marks on Hajin's face from the blows inflicted by his attacker before he managed to escape. Explaining his condition through vague hints of recent unpleasant events, the protagonist asked his friend to let him explain everything later, once he had thought of the right words. Shin Woo, understanding at once, refrained from prying further and simply suggested Hajin relax by taking a warm bath, a gesture surprisingly generous. For added comfort, he even gave him his own clothes, making sure Hajin felt at ease in his home, as if he weren't just a guest. Though it was his first time in his friend's apartment, Hajin felt anxious about arriving so suddenly, especially with bruises on his face and in such a terribly low state. He was deeply ashamed of everything, but nonetheless, he found the apartment quite cozy, even admiring certain pieces of furniture. Shin Woo, returning with the clothes, directed him to the bathroom, explaining how to get there so he wouldn't accidentally lose his way in the unfamiliar place, and advised him not to rush but to take his time and relax. Hajin was immensely grateful to his friend for handling his unannounced visit with such calmness and for being so willing to help. However, Shin Woo insisted he shouldn't dwell on it and simply repay him with a meal in the future, as it would be no trouble and would give them more time to spend together. In the bath, as he submerged his head under the water, Hajin couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. The man who had attacked him in his own home, and his desire to leave this world, which had been so overwhelming until the appearance of the mysterious stranger who started that conversation. Reflecting on it all, Hajin involuntarily recalled the kiss, which had occurred without his consent. Strangely, it wasn't the worst event of that night in his mind. Suddenly, he was horrified. He hadn't wanted anything like that, and thinking about the kiss with a stranger in such a way felt odd and even shameful to him. Though Kael had saved him from death, he had no right to act so freely, and Hajin still had many questions about his identity, especially the presence of wings. His behavior was unusual, but that could be attributed to mental issues, unlike the physical peculiarities of the man's body. Moreover, the protagonist noticed a strange symbol on his hand, resembling a tattoo of two wings, one black and one white, which had definitely not been there before. His friend grew concerned, asking if he had fallen asleep in the bath, prompting Hajin to hurry out so he could get some sleep. They rested on the same bed, and the protagonist thanked his friend for offering such a comfortable place and for not asking too many questions about what had happened. That night, Hajin had a strange, inappropriate dream, in which the man who had saved him featured prominently, and upon waking, he was horrified by his thoughts. Hajin felt deep shame. He didn't even know the name of the man who had appeared in such a strange dream, and he never expected something like this would happen to him. After calming himself a little, he noticed a note on the nightstand left by his friend, who was still peacefully asleep in the bed. In the note, Shinwoo mentioned he had to step out briefly for some errands, but he had left breakfast on the table, knowing Hajin would be too embarrassed to rummage through someone else's fridge. Hajin realized how much his friend cared for him and decided he couldn't stay any longer, not wanting to abuse his friend's kindness. Indeed, there was a sandwich waiting in the kitchen, along with a glass of water set out to make Hajin as comfortable as possible. Without touching the food, Hajin placed a note of his own beside it, gathered his clothes, and quietly left, shutting the door behind him, though still unsure where to go. Once again, he found himself running, even though his life was no longer in danger. He was simply overwhelmed with guilt for inconveniencing his best friend the previous night. Eventually, Hajin ended up back at the same bridge, but this time he had no intention of jumping. He merely stood in the same spot, unable to understand why he had contemplated such a drastic act yesterday. Walking up to the railing, he looked down. The height now seemed immense to him. At this moment, he knew he didn't have the courage to climb it again. It was yet another confirmation that his mind had not been clear the night before, and it was astonishing to him that he was still alive, thanks only to the stranger. Unexpectedly, the fair-haired man appeared beside him, as if he had read Hajin's thoughts the boy would never dare voice aloud. The man seemed entirely unsurprised by the encounter, as if he had foreseen it from the start, his expression remaining just as haughty. He tried to talk about what had happened the previous night, knowing full well how the boy who had nearly died here must feel now. Surely the bridge terrified him. Instead of answering the man's questions, Hajin grew curious about his savior's identity. Clearly, this man was different from other people, if only for the wings. The question made the man ponder the consequences of the previous evening, and he began to inspect the exposed parts of Hajin's body. Suddenly, he noticed the tattoo on Hajin's wrist, the one that had only recently appeared, and realized he was now obliged to explain everything. Kael then admitted honestly that he was an angel, but a certain incident had made him different from others of his kind. Now he was considered only half an angel. The protagonist immediately guessed that this meant Kael was a fallen angel, which was, in fact, correct. It was difficult to believe such information, and Hajin remained speechless for a time, unsure how to respond to what he had just learned. Yet Kael didn't seem bothered by this disbelief. His arrogant demeanor persisted as he continued speaking to the boy. All the while, the man was eating a candy, and now he did so even more intently, which caught Hajin's attention, reminding him of the strange dream he'd had the night before. This only boosted Kael's confidence, as he assumed the recent kiss had left a strong impression on Hajin, given how intently the boy was watching him now. Such remarks not only embarrassed Hajin, but also frightened him, as he feared Kael was referring to the dream. After all, who knew what angels were capable of? Perhaps he already knew everything. As soon as Hajin realized what Kael had actually meant, he felt even more uncomfortable, for he had already mentioned the strange vision during their conversation. The angel seemed to think he could pressure the boy once again, pushing him to repeat what had happened the day before, growing more insistent. However, Kael seemed oblivious to Hajin's increasingly negative reaction, even laughing at his own jokes as though everything was perfectly natural. Still, Kael tried to change the subject, claiming that saving Hajin the night before had exhausted him, as though subtly blaming him for it. In truth, Kael wasn't feeling great, but his words were just an excuse, hoping to coax the boy into agreeing to another kiss. Surprisingly, Hajin responded differently than expected. He confessed to the angel, a near stranger, that he had been pursued for a long time and couldn't deal with it on his own. The culprit was a former classmate who had bullied him since high school, tormenting him because Hajin was gay. Hajin had feared attending the same college as this person, so right after graduation he enlisted in the army, hoping time would ease their conflict. However, Hajin hadn't anticipated that the bully would continue to stalk him even at university, even discovering his address despite his attempts to keep it hidden. It had all started when Hajin tried to go to the police, but afterward, his tormentor had attacked him again, this time in his own apartment. Defending himself, Hajin struck the man with a lamp, perhaps even killing him. Kael immediately understood that Hajin had shared all this in the hope that the angel might help him deal with the situation, to punish his tormentor. But even Hajin couldn't explain why an angel would agree to such a thing. Though Kael claimed to act out of kindness, fallen angels weren't bound by such rules. Still, in return for his assistance, Kael asked for one seemingly simple favor. Though his words were chilling, he requested Hajin's soul in exchange. Kael found the boy intriguing, as his angelic abilities had no effect on him, unlike with others. The angel wasn't afraid to intimidate the unfortunate boy, hinting that bad things could happen if he refused, which helped to convince him. Though, in truth, the contract had already been sealed, as confirmed by the tattoo on his wrist. Now they would need to kiss each other regularly, and thanks to the mark, Kael would be able to find Hajin at any moment and save him from danger. The angel understood that, in truth, he wouldn't be able to help this person. After what had happened to him, he had become powerless as an angel and was forced to live among humans. Moreover, in order to continue his existence, he had to take human souls, which made him cruel, though it was a necessity. Thus, their agreement was one-sided. The protagonist would be the one to help the angel, while Kael, despite his promises, wouldn't intervene. The next kiss lasted far longer than the previous one. Kael enjoyed it even more, while the boy was more unsettled by the brazen act. The angel found the protagonist's flustered reaction endearing and didn't hesitate to voice his amusement at the boy's innocence, knowing they would be spending quite a lot of time together. Kael wanted to know the name of the person whose soul would sustain him, but Hajin stubbornly refused to share it. As he walked away, Hajin regretted agreeing to all of this. He could no longer justify his actions by the despair he had felt the night before, standing on the edge of the bridge. Meanwhile, Kael followed close behind, not letting Hajin out of his sight, demanding the boy tell him his name, and at one point even flew on his wings through the center of the city. This surprised Hajin. Other people could see Kael too, which could create problems, but it turned out only Hajin could see him in such moments. The angel was relentless in his pursuit of more information about Hajin, but the boy refused, already regretting the deal he'd made. After all, the mark on his wrist would allow Kael to find him at any time, so it seemed pointless to share more details. Yet Kael insisted that, like any two people who spoke with each other, they should at least exchange names. Hajin pondered for a long time whether it made sense to open up to such a strange man, who unnerved him with his overconfidence. At that moment, Kael realized that Hajin already belonged to him and would do everything he required. He couldn't lose sight of such a special person. Suddenly, the protagonist made up his mind and revealed his name, then quickly walked away, hoping this would finally end Kael's pursuit. But he was wrong. Kael continued to press him on other matters, asking about significant moments in his life, and eventually introduced himself in return, making them a little closer. Now Hajin could learn more about the one helping him, and he wanted to know why an angel would need a human soul. Kael claimed it was a custom among angels to repay for their help in this way, but that wasn't the truth. By that time, they had reached Hajin's apartment. Kael had accompanied him all the way back to the place he had fled the night before. Hajin was afraid to open the door, unsure if he wanted to find a dead body inside or a living enemy who might attack him at any moment. At first, Kael didn't understand why the boy hesitated to enter his own home, standing at the threshold with his hand on the door handle. But then he realized what was troubling him and decided to help, placing his hand over Hajin's to give him the courage to push the door open. The door was unlocked and opened easily, but no one rushed out to attack the boy. However, the mess inside was obvious, confirming Hajin's story. There was a blood stain on the bed from the previous night's incident, but the bed itself was empty. The gangster had left, meaning he was still alive. On the one hand, this was good. Hajin wouldn't be jailed for such a terrible crime, but there was still the risk of a second attack. Kael lay down on the bed, unbothered by the bloodstain, and deliberately reminded Hajin that he was still in danger, making sure the boy wouldn't run away. Hajin could see this was a form of manipulation, but he didn't say anything. After all, Kael was right. He simply glared at the angel. Seizing the opportunity, Kael suggested that living in this apartment would be difficult, as the criminal knew where to find him. But with nowhere else to go, and unable to live with his friend forever, Hajin was left with no choice but to clean up the mess and hope not to encounter his attacker anytime soon. Suddenly, Kael pulled Hajin close by the hand and offered for him to move in with him. After all, they'd be seeing each other often, and it would keep Hajin safe. At first, Hajin was furious at such audacious behavior and the unpleasant offer, so he began hitting Kael with pillows in frustration. Yet eventually, he realized that this was the safest and most practical option. Otherwise, he'd constantly live in fear of being found. Kael's apartment turned out to be quite luxurious, filled with expensive furniture. It was clear that the angel had money, though it wasn't obvious how he earned it. Kael wasn't very cautious with his guest, merely advising him not to worry about staying there temporarily before heading to another room to change his clothes. The life of an angel, as imagined by churchgoers, typically didn't involve such lavish accommodations. Considering he was a fallen angel, Hajin assumed Kael must have acquired his wealth through dishonest means, and his personality only reinforced that suspicion. Suddenly, the apartment's owner emerged from the shower, wearing nothing but a towel, which embarrassed the boy who stood nearby. Though his appearance was indeed inappropriate, Kael brushed it off, attributing Hajin's reaction to his imagination, as if the boy's strange dreams were to blame. Hajin regretted ever letting the angel know about those dreams, and he was even more upset now, not wanting to see such things, even in his sleep. Unfazed, the angel continued pressing his advantage, suggesting they sleep together, and suddenly threw himself on top of Hajin, pinning him down on the couch. Of course, given the man's actions and appearance, Hajin thought he was offering the same thing he had seen in his dream, which made him extremely flustered, and he quickly tried to refuse. In reality, Kael only meant they should sleep in the same bed, but seeing Hajin's reaction, he thought there was no need to stop there. The angel tried to play it off as if his intentions were innocent, explaining that he assumed Hajin might be scared of being in a new place, which is why he didn't want to leave him alone. However, the protagonist could clearly see that the man was just trying to take advantage of the situation, pretending he hadn't implied anything inappropriate. Hajin pulled himself free from the man's grip and headed for the bathroom, stating that he needed to shower before bed, though in reality, it was just an excuse to leave the room. Kael stayed in the living room, reflecting on how he had never brought anyone into his home before, but this boy was clearly going to be special to him. Suddenly, he found himself embarrassed too, realizing what was happening, despite the fact that such emotions had never affected him in the past. In the bathroom, Hajin chastised himself for the thoughts that had slipped into his mind earlier, though it was Kael who had provoked them. Still, he knew he needed to maintain control. As he tried to focus on the shower, he heard the angel's voice calling him to join him for dinner and urging him to hurry up with his bath. It turned out Kael had been quite brazen. He had opened the bathroom door fully, catching a glimpse of Hajin without clothes. Afterward, they sat together for dinner. Though Kael sported a noticeable bruise on his forehead from where Hajin had thrown something at him for peeking, the protagonist sat across from him, still seething with anger. He couldn't believe anyone would open the bathroom door when someone was inside. Nevertheless, the angel continued to argue, blaming Hajin for the incident, saying that he could have locked the door from the inside but chose not to. Hajin attempted to threaten Kael, knowing how important it was for him to receive parts of his soul to maintain his strength. But his efforts were fruitless, and in his frustration, Hajin threw a spoon at Kael, aiming for the bruise he had inflicted earlier to cause more pain. In return, Kael merely commented on how thin Hajin was. After a hearty meal, Kael decided to watch a movie and suggested Hajin join him before they went to sleep. However, the boy was too exhausted from the day's events and simply asked which room he could sleep in, eager to rest as soon as possible. Sensing that his guest might think him too forward, Hajin clarified his behavior by explaining that he was just trying to relax in a place where he might have to stay for some time. Despite his words, Hajin didn't seem calm or relaxed. His anxiety was apparent, which was to be expected in such a situation. Still, the protagonist tried to remain composed, waiting for the homeowner to tell him which room he could go to, and he intended to head there immediately. But the angel brazenly declared that staying in his home required payment. So it was time for another kiss. Hajin immediately thought about paying in money, which, unfortunately, he didn't have. It had been foolish of him to assume everything would be free. However, Kael had something entirely different in mind, calling Hajin closer to carry out his intent. The angel demanded initiative this time, insisting that Hajin kiss him instead, though in the past, this had always happened without Hajin's consent. Unsure, the boy hesitated. Hajin was embarrassed and reluctant to do it, but he understood that he was here for a reason, and enduring this nightmare might be necessary to achieve his goal. The physical contact became much more intimate. Kael insisted that Hajin sit on his lap before proceeding with the act. Now, for the first time, Hajin was actually kissing this stranger by his own will. He could no longer claim he was forced. He didn't know how long such an arrangement would last or how long this particular interaction would go on, so he tried to relax as much as he could. Unexpectedly, he found himself thinking that perhaps he didn't mind it, as Kael's lips were soft and gentle. But Kael's persistence became overwhelming. He pulled Hajin close and pressed his entire body against him, emboldened by a sense of entitlement. Moreover, Kael grabbed Hajin's wrists and pinned them to the couch, laying him down on his back. The situation was rapidly escalating into something far more dangerous than a simple kiss. It lasted so long that Hajin started to feel a sharp lack of air, likely due to his inexperience. He simply couldn't keep up. Suddenly, Kael declared that he wanted to help Hajin deal with the bully who had been tormenting him as soon as possible, manipulating his emotions to get what he wanted. Justifying his actions with supposedly good intentions, the angel suggested they should move to a more intimate level, claiming it would benefit them both. Hajin wasn't sure if he wanted this, but Kael began to apply emotional pressure, trying to force him into agreeing. In the end, Kael decided to take what he wanted without waiting for any response from his partner, moving beyond just kissing Hajin's lips. However, very soon the protagonist openly said he didn't want to continue, which made Kael shift back to coaxing him, hoping things would proceed voluntarily. The angel told him that with more intimate contact, a larger portion of his soul would be transferred, which, according to Kael, would speed up the entire process. In truth, this was a lie. The exchange could only happen through a kiss, so what Kael was doing was purely for his own satisfaction. In this way, the fair-haired man was testing how far he could push his new companion, wondering if he could go beyond what was acceptable without crossing into something criminal. Suddenly, Hajin realized there wasn't much difference between the man who was supposedly trying to help him and the one who had attacked him not long ago. Kael immediately tried to convince him otherwise, claiming there was a significant difference. Although in reality, he was simply manipulating Hajin more skillfully, using him for his own ends. Of course, Hajin's deepest wish was to be rid of the stalker who wouldn't leave him alone, but even this was too much for him. Nonetheless, when he asked if this would truly help and heard Kael's blatant lie, he chose to believe it, agreeing to everything just to make it end as quickly as possible. At that point, Hajin gave his full agreement, though he tried to warn Kael that he had no prior experience. But he wasn't allowed to finish his sentence. From the very first touch, Kael enjoyed the feel of Hajin's body, though he didn't say it aloud. It was obvious enough through his actions. He began to tease the protagonist, but Hajin didn't like it at all. He demanded that Kael stop, and while the angel listened, he merely shifted to something else. Everything was happening too fast. Hajin wasn't prepared for what came next, and so he tried to cover himself with his hands for as long as possible. But when the angel commanded him to stop, Hajin found himself unable to refuse, as the words were more of an order than a request. To Hajin's surprise, Kael seemed to care about his comfort and tried to ensure he wouldn't feel too overwhelmed, paying attention to his inexperience. Even with Kael's attempts at gentleness, it didn't prevent Hajin from feeling pain. The further their intimate contact progressed, the more Hajin tried to push the angel away. This continued until he began to adjust, and only then did he realize that such an experience might not be as revolting as he had initially thought. Perhaps it could even be something pleasant. The following day was bright and sunny, and the young man headed to the university. During a break between classes, Hajin sat on a bench, lost in thought about what had transpired the day before. At first, everything seemed unbearable due to the intense pain, but eventually it got better. That morning, the young man woke up feeling cleansed, as if an angel had aided him. Recalling everything that had happened, he felt both embarrassed and angry at Kael for such reckless actions. Nevertheless, if this would help him rid himself of the stalker once and for all, Hajin was willing to endure. Suddenly, his best friend approached him, noticing the strange mood of the protagonist. He also observed unusual marks on his neck, which made him concerned. When they had spent the night together, those marks hadn't been there, which meant something else had happened. The protagonist didn't immediately understand what he meant, and his friend didn't press him for answers. Finally, Hajin confessed that a stalker had been troubling him for quite some time. This revelation surprised his friend, who started speculating loudly about the situation, much to the protagonist's displeasure, as he feared others might overhear such personal information. Shinwoo couldn't comprehend why his friend had hidden something like this for so long and hadn't asked for help. However, Hajin simply couldn't bring himself to burden him with such a problem, as he had already caused enough trouble. In truth, his friend had been helping him for a long time, ever since school, when other students had bullied him. Even now, he wanted to offer Hajin a place to stay until his home was safe again. Yet, there was no need for that, as Hajin had already found a place to stay. The protagonist wasn't eager to reveal the identity of his new housemate, since Kael wasn't. Familiar with his circle, and explaining the entire situation would be difficult. Shinwoo expressed interest in meeting this person, but Hajin wasn't sure if it would be possible, as his relationship with the angel was highly unconventional. Meanwhile, Kael was approaching the bench near the university where the friends were seated. The protagonist didn't know how to describe the inappropriate nature of his roommate, so he hesitated and didn't even notice when Kael sneaked up behind him. The angel immediately realized they were discussing him, but remained as nonchalant as ever. His sudden appearance startled the protagonist, who at first couldn't understand how the man had found the university where he studied, but quickly remembered the mark. The brazen angel examined the marks on the young man's neck, which he himself had left not long ago. He was amused by how they looked, a reaction that seemed odd to others. Then Kael openly began discussing what had transpired between them the previous night. Shinwoo watched the entire exchange with obvious jealousy. The angel, as if deliberately, leaned close to the protagonist's ear and whispered something inappropriate. The young man was infuriated by this behavior, as they weren't a couple. They were bound only by a contract. Shinwoo couldn't hold back any longer and wanted to know what exactly their relationship was. This question left Hajin in an awkward position. He didn't know how to respond. The angel, being more quick-witted, declared that he was the young man's guardian. Despite this, Hajin's friend wasn't comfortable leaving him with such a suspicious individual. So he mentioned that they had planned to have lunch together, trying to take Hajin away with him. Kael grew irritated by such interference, as he didn't like being interrupted like that. The protagonist had completely forgotten that he intended to spend time with his friend, while the angel only made things worse with his improper behavior in public, forcing the young man to cover his mouth to make him fall silent, if only for a moment. He also apologized to his friend, admitting he had forgotten their plans. Still, he chose to leave with the angel, due to their contract and the fact that Kael wouldn't leave them alone so easily. Kael, realizing that the young man wasn't going anywhere, grabbed his hand and dragged him away. Shinwoo, still unsure of what had just happened, remained behind, alone. The angel only made it to the first quiet street before he began kissing the protagonist. He seemed thoroughly satisfied with what he had achieved. After the long-awaited kiss, the man felt significantly better, knowing he could live a little longer thanks to a fragment of the young man's soul. Yet it wasn't enough for him. He craved more and openly said so, but the protagonist stopped him, insisting they needed to discuss a few ground rules, considering their peculiar relationship. The young man made it clear that he didn't want the angel coming to his school unannounced, even if Kael needed energy for catching the criminal. It seemed Kael couldn't care less about what he was being told, or any of the requests from the one bound to him by contract. It was as if he wasn't even listening. All he was interested in was another kiss, so he silenced the protagonist by force and resumed kissing him. At some point, noticing Hajin's strong resistance, the brazen angel finally stopped, likely realizing he might scare away someone so valuable. He suggested they grab something to eat, justifying his sudden behavior by mentioning that the previous night he had noticed how thin his partner was and concluded he needed to eat more. The angel didn't bother to hide his wings, glowing with happiness from absorbing energy, and his feathers seemed even a shade lighter. As they sat at home, about to eat, Hajin kept checking his phone, as if waiting for an important call or message, which piqued the man's curiosity. In reality, Hajin feared his enemy might call him after what had happened between them that night and threatened to find him again. The protagonist approached Kael, hoping to hear how the search was progressing. After all, Kael had promised to help, and Hajin sought reassurance. However, the news was far from comforting, as the angel had yet to even find the young man's assailant or learn what he looked like. The fact that the villain hadn't acted again was both a relief and a source of fear, raising questions about the contract. Hajin wanted to know how Kael planned to solve the problem and when. He felt he was paying enough and thus deserved to know how much longer he would have to live in fear of his tormentor. Kael understood the young man's suffering, realizing that, despite fulfilling the contract, The real danger hadn't been addressed. But the angel was only doing it to ensure his own survival. So he continued to lie, saying that too little time had passed for him to gather the necessary energy. The protagonist grew anxious, uncertain when the bandit would contact him again and whether he could avoid further torment. To alleviate the situation somewhat, the angel proposed accompanying him home after classes, ensuring he wouldn't be left alone and wouldn't need to worry about an attack. Moreover, in an emergency, the angel could quickly find the young man's location and help resolve the issue. However, Kael's demeanor was so menacing that his offer of protection seemed more like a threat than a solution to the problem. Hence, Hajin quickly declined, insisting it was unnecessary, as he didn't want unsavory rumors spreading around the university. Once again, the man lied, promising to deal with the scoundrel. But in exchange, he demanded one condition. Touching the young man's lips, he declared that kisses must happen no less than once a day. In response to this touch, he immediately got bitten on the hand, as Hajin had made it clear many times before that he didn't like being touched without permission. Besides, the condition seemed odd, as they were already kissing. Why request it again? Hajin wasn't against it. However, it turned out that wasn't all. The angel wanted something else. Something unpleasant for Hajin. The protagonist was not to get too close to his friend, nor allow him to touch him, which seemed strange, given that there was no romantic relationship between them. Though Hajin saw nothing in Shinwoo's actions beyond friendly care, it was evident to others that his friend was in love with him. That's why Shinwoo had been so upset when Kael behaved so freely around him, hinting that something more than a kiss had happened the night before. Kael, on the other hand, didn't want to share the person who provided him with such precious energy, even if it was all due to a false contract. The angel's thoughts were interrupted by his housemate's voice, as Hajin tried to explain that Shinwoo was nothing more than a good friend to him. The man's mood shifted abruptly. He no longer seemed interested in conversation and, instead, pulled the young man toward him with sudden force. It turned out there was yet another important condition Kael had forgotten to mention, but one that couldn't be overlooked. Hajin didn't like this. At first, there had been only one rule, but now there were two, and soon there would be a third. Too many restrictions for a relationship like theirs. Kael, however, wanted to extract as much as possible from the young man and thus demanded close physical contact daily, just like the kisses, claiming he needed it for his powers. This, however, did not sit well with the protagonist, and he immediately bit the bold angel to show his displeasure with the suggestion. Yet Kael persisted, insisting that it was necessary for their shared goal, and that it would be best if Hajin just agreed and got it over with. The young man couldn't accept this specific condition, so he compromised, promising to do it twice a week, hoping that would suffice. Although the angel was frustrated that he couldn't get what he wanted, he had no choice but to agree. Meanwhile, the protagonist's enemy was already standing outside the house where Hajin now lived, having clearly tracked down his location. Soon, the rainy season arrived, and one day, the downpour came quite unexpectedly. The protagonist was unprepared and had forgotten his umbrella. He had been living by the rules set by the angel for some time, but he still hadn't seen any progress. Unsure of how to hasten the process, he began jotting down his worries on a piece of paper that day, seemingly paying no attention to his professor's lecture. One of the things that bothered him most about this strange relationship was that the angel would sometimes return home with signs of having been in contact with others, clearly not faithful to him. Moreover, during those times, Kael was always exhausted. While their relationship was such that the angel's involvement with others shouldn't have bothered him, Hajin still resented having to endure all the restrictions alone. He was forced into close contact with someone like that, which he found distasteful, but he had no choice. He didn't want this situation at all and could only hope it would resolve quickly, allowing him to return to a normal life. Suddenly, a message appeared on his phone. He glanced at the screen, visibly startled and unsure of what to do next. Outside stood Shinwoo, who had texted his friend, suggesting they meet after classes, as they hadn't had a proper conversation earlier that morning. Seeing Hajin approaching the university, Shinwoo called out to him, wanting to check in after their last meeting, which hadn't ended well. He wanted to know if everything was all right with his friend. He began asking a slew of questions, ones he hadn't had time to ask during their previous encounter. The man who had been with Hajin then seemed strange, and he had taken Hajin away too quickly. The protagonist tried to reassure his friend that everything was fine and that there was no reason to worry, then hurriedly excused himself, not wanting to break the contract's conditions. Claiming he was late, he fled from his friend, hoping to avoid any misunderstandings should Shinwoo accidentally touch him. His response to the messages was also cold, saying he had to leave class early and wouldn't be able to have lunch with him. Shinwoo wanted to ask if he was going to meet that strange man again, but ultimately couldn't bring himself to send the message. Hajin's friend felt saddened by the situation, hoping at least that his friend had an umbrella and wouldn't get drenched on his way home. The rain only grew heavier, and it was clear the weather wouldn't improve by the end of the day. Kael, too, began worrying about his housemate. He asked Hajin if he had everything he needed to get home, but he received no reply, leaving him uncertain about what to do. So, the angel decided to head toward the university, thinking it would be safer to meet the protagonist just in case. Unexpectedly, he ran into Shinwoo, who was still standing there despite the rain, perhaps waiting to meet his friend. They greeted each other, both trying to remain polite, though it was clear that they found one another irritating. Kael immediately understood that Shinwoo wasn't there by coincidence. But since his partner hadn't mentioned any plans to meet, it seemed he hadn't known either. Shinwoo was visibly irritated by the stranger's arrogant tone, especially since they didn't even know each other's names. Kael didn't understand the issue and suggested that Shinwoo address him informally, as the protagonist always did. The mention of Hajin's name only infuriated Shinwoo further, and he began asking just how close the angel's relationship with his housemate really was. However, Kael didn't want to answer and instead hinted that if Shinwoo was such a good friend, he could ask Hajin himself. This only aggravated Shinwoo more, as he hadn't been able to speak properly with his friend in some time, something Kael surely knew. So, Shinwoo asked if Kael was living with the protagonist, but received no answer, as that was also something Hajin could tell him. Suddenly, Kael's phone rang, and it became clear that it was his housemate calling to say his classes had ended. The angel realized he had come at the right time and was fortunate to be waiting for the protagonist with an umbrella right outside the university. Yet something troubled him. The young man's voice sounded uneasy, even fearful. Unable to explain what had happened over the phone, Hajin's tone alarmed Kael, who rushed to the university entrance, fearing for him. Hajin ran up to him, tears in his eyes and anger burning toward the angel, as he was the only one upholding the contract's terms. His enemy was still pursuing him. Hajin had just received another threat, with the villain promising to find him no matter how far he tried to run. Shinwoo observed the scene from a distance, likely never having seen his friend so distressed before, and was visibly shocked. Hajin suggested that perhaps Kael wasn't able to resolve the problem because he was taking too little of his soul, offering him more. In his shock, Hajin didn't even realize they were standing in a crowded place, right by the university. He no longer cared where or how to transfer the energy as long as it saved him. And so, Hajin kissed the angel. For the first time, he initiated it, without being asked or required to as payment for the help he was receiving. This act made Shinwoo realize a great deal. Clearly, the person he was in love with was happy with someone else, and he had no choice but to step aside. The angel himself couldn't quite understand what had come over the young man. Hajin had never done anything like this before, not even when they were alone at home. As much as Kael appreciated the gesture, he had to gently push the young man away, realizing it was unwise to allow him to act this way right at the entrance of the university. It could only make things worse for him. However, Hajin was still unable to think clearly. He sobbed, pleading for Kael to take more of his soul. He was willing to do anything to finally rid himself of his enemy. There was no point in trying to explain anything to him at that moment, so Kael simply held him, attempting to calm him down, promising that he would do whatever Hajin asked. But later, Shinwoo, deeply upset by what he had witnessed, now realized he needn't have worried about his friend being without an umbrella. Someone else was clearly taking care of him. Without a word, he walked away. After the incident, Kael decided to let Hajin rest in his room, offering him the comfort of a large bed after he had taken a hot shower. Once the shock of the stalker's message began to wear off, Hajin realized the enormity of his mistake. How could he have kissed the angel right in front of the university? He knew such an action could have dire consequences, especially since he had worked hard to hide his attraction to men in school to avoid becoming a target for bullying. He also wondered why his former classmate continued to pursue him. They no longer had any reason to cross paths, so what was the motive behind this behavior? Suddenly, the angel entered the room, curious to know if the protagonist was feeling any better, as it was obvious that after the unpleasant incident, he hadn't been doing well. Of course, Kael couldn't resist making a small joke, calling Hajin a crybaby, but there was a seriousness in his tone, knowing he too was partly to blame for the situation. The whole episode had surprised him as well. Kael hadn't expected that bringing an umbrella to his housemate at the university would result in witnessing him in such a vulnerable state. Given the reckless act that jeopardized his future, it was clear that under extreme stress, Hajin was unable to think rationally. After all, the last time he had even attempted to jump off a bridge, another irrational decision. It was becoming evident that Hajin was extremely emotional. As they discussed everything, the young man began to cry again. He was still terrified that the stalker would find him, and that the attack would happen again. He wouldn't be able to defend himself. The angel realized he would actually have to do something to fulfill his part of the contract, even though not long ago he hadn't planned on it. Now, however, he gave an earnest promise that he would start searching for the person tormenting Hajin, hoping this would finally bring the young man some peace. Unexpectedly, Kael brought up Hajin's friend, mentioning how obviously jealous Shinwoo had been near the university. It was hard to believe Hajin hadn't noticed his feelings. Hajin truly hadn't suspected anything. But such things happen. Sometimes even close friends hide their feelings if they think revealing them could hurt the other. The angel decided not to disturb him any further, suggesting Hajin could either rest or have something to eat. As for himself, it was clear he had plans despite the bad weather. Hajin, suddenly curious, asked about Kael's plans for the evening. He suspected the angel was off to meet someone again, and his words came out as a reproach. Kael was surprised. Hajin had never shown any interest in such matters before, and it seemed as if he had been counting down the days until their contract ended. Now the protagonist openly acknowledged Kael's meetings with others, and the angel didn't deny it, since it was nothing more than the truth. Although Kael's private life wasn't supposed to concern Hajin, the young man couldn't help but feel hurt, knowing he was the only one who had to endure the restrictions while Kael faced none. The angel was somewhat annoyed by this, feeling that Hajin had no right to be jealous, given the nature of their relationship and the fact that this contract was primarily for his own benefit. However, it was Kael who had placed the mark on him and who had set the terms Hajin had been forced to agree to. Hajin suspected the issue lay in his agreement to transfer energy only twice a week. It likely wasn't enough for the angel. Of course, this was true, but Kael didn't want to admit it and appear selfish. Instead of being reprimanded, however, Kael was suddenly taken aback by an offer. Hajin was willing to increase the frequency of energy transfers if it meant Kael would stop going on other meetings. Although Hajin wanted this ordeal to end as quickly as possible, he didn't want to be in such intimate contact with someone who wasn't exclusive to him. This admission deeply surprised Kael. He didn't know how to react. On one hand, the news was welcome, but it was odd that Hajin had even noticed the marks left on Kael after his encounters with others. Hajin also saw a benefit for himself. If he could give more of his soul, the problem would be resolved faster. At that moment, the angel felt terrible, knowing he should tell Hajin that energy could only be taken through kisses. Yet, he didn't want to lose such an opportunity. Regardless, he was ready to agree, because when the sweet young man looked so upset, it was hard to refuse him, despite the discomfort it might bring. Moreover, Kael was now determined to ensure that Hajin also gained something meaningful from the deal, although he hadn't planned to offer that before. In the end, Kael agreed not to meet with anyone else, but requested the right to choose the days when their close contact would occur. Even this didn't scare Hajin. He was ready to comply with any conditions as long as his interests were also considered. Kael admitted that he had a meeting planned for that night, but now he couldn't go through with it, as he had promised to remain faithful until the end of their strange arrangement. The protagonist hadn't expected things to change so suddenly, but he had chosen these rules himself and would have to abide by them. However, Kael, understanding how difficult Hajin's day had been, asked for his permission this time. Hajin, determined to handle it, agreed without hesitation, allowing Kael to do whatever he wanted with him. After everything that had happened, while the angel was in the shower, the protagonist wondered if he had made the right choice in letting someone so unfamiliar get so close to him. He didn't know what the future held, but at that moment, he liked the connection and didn't see anything wrong or frightening about it. Meanwhile, Kael's phone kept receiving messages from the person he was supposed to meet that evening, wondering where his partner had disappeared to. The next day, Kael realized that the human body was even more fragile than he had initially thought. Exposure to both cold and heat had taken its toll. The protagonist had fallen ill and couldn't even get out of bed, feeling utterly miserable due to a high fever. Hajin blamed the angel for it, as Kael hadn't let him go the previous evening, forcing him to continue their special energy transfer, even though he was already freezing. However, it might have also been because Hajin had recklessly run out into the rain without an umbrella by the university when his mind wasn't clear. He didn't have the strength to argue. He had indeed made several thoughtless decisions that night, leading to his current state. Nonetheless, such situations would no longer occur if Kael managed to get rid of the stalker as quickly as possible. It was strange how much he wanted this person out of his life. So much so that even now, while lying sick and in relative safety, his thoughts lingered on that threat. He was willing to make many sacrifices to achieve this goal, hoping that afterward he could terminate the contract and no longer be bound to the angel. However, Kael had entirely different plans. Even now, he stated that he wouldn't let the young man simply run away, even when it was all over. Hajin was the reason Kael could continue to live, so there was no way he could let him go that easily, even after the stalker was dealt with. Meanwhile, Hajin fell asleep, but it was clear that his illness was serious and they had no medicine in the house. Kael decided to step out for a while to buy everything necessary, especially since the rain had stopped and the weather had cleared up. The angel was slightly irritated with his partner, thinking how weak he was to fall ill from something so trivial. Suddenly, he remembered how Hajin had run to him outside the university. It had been a desperate move, revealing just how terrified the young man had been by the threats. It was strange to hear someone beg for more of their soul to be taken, as if they didn't understand the value of their own life. This was something he needed to discuss with Hajin. But first, it was more important to give him medicine and help him recover as soon as possible. Kael had never bought such things before, as he had never dealt with illnesses, being far from an ordinary human. As he walked, a strange young man wearing a cap that obscured his face bumped into him, causing Kael to drop his phone. The stranger didn't even apologize for the blatant shove, and though Kael scolded him, it seemed the man paid no attention. The man simply adjusted his clothing and walked away without looking back, his behavior outrageously arrogant. Kael picked up his phone and realized it was cracked, which only made him angrier at the rude stranger. Nonetheless, he continued to the pharmacy and bought a variety of medicines, perhaps more than necessary, but he figured they could be useful in the future. Knowing nothing about human treatments, he simply purchased everything the pharmacist suggested, without even looking at the names or prices. He even bought an appetite stimulant and a special ointment, just to ensure his partner had everything he might need. After all, in order to draw energy from Hajin, he needed to maintain his health and well-being, so it was essential to do everything possible for the young man. Suddenly, as he approached his home, Kael noticed a stranger peering into the windows, clearly searching for someone. It was the same man who had bumped into him earlier. Kael considered walking past, thinking it would be best to avoid an unpleasant confrontation. But then he recalled something. There had been a time when Hajin described his stalker in great detail, and it became clear that the man before him was the same villain. So the threats to find Hajin hadn't been mere words. This man had quickly discovered his new place of residence. Enduring such relentless harassment must have been unbearable, and Kael finally understood why Hajin had been so desperate that fateful night. Thus, Kael decided to confront the stalker, pretending to know little about him, and accused him of causing damage to his phone in the earlier collision, suggesting they discuss compensation. The stalker tried to act as if he hadn't been the one, but Kael informed him that he remembered his face perfectly. They soon found themselves in a less crowded area, where Kael no longer hesitated to use force, striking the vile man and calling him by his name. The stalker was shocked. He had never mentioned his name aloud, which made it clear that this situation wasn't just about the phone. Of course, Kael didn't intend to kill him, merely frighten him enough to prevent further harm to Hajin. The angel demanded that the stalker stop harassing the young man and let him live in peace, reminding him that Hajin already had enough problems. The aggressive man then assumed that Kael too was gay and began spewing hateful remarks in his direction. But Kael was more than capable of defending himself, and the stalker soon regretted his arrogance, realizing he had underestimated the angel's strength. Soon, Kael returned home, still reflecting on what had happened. As it turned out, he wasn't as useless at solving other people's problems as he once thought. After the aggression directed at him, the angel was no longer polite, speaking to the stalker just as harshly in return. trying to prove that the harassment had to stop. He didn't want to deal with the man too severely right away, as he was still getting some benefit while the deal was in effect. He sought a temporary solution instead. However, the villain refused to back down, remaining just as rude to the person who had generously chosen not to deal with him harshly from the start. Kael kept trying, again and again, until it became clear that nothing was working. At that point, he looked into the stalker's eyes and used hypnosis. Naturally, the scoundrel resisted and even avoided looking him in the eye, fearing he would finally receive the punishment he deserved for all his actions. In the end, Kael managed to use suggestion to make the man forget he had ever seen any of Hajin's partners, erasing all memory of his hatred for him. After that, the stalker was left speechless and immediately passed out. His body was far weaker than he appeared. He had only seemed intimidating, but in truth, could do nothing. Nevertheless, the ordeal had drained Kael. He had used a considerable amount of energy just to make the man forget. Suddenly, Hajin woke up, finally able to get out of bed and make his way to the kitchen for some water. His housemate hadn't noticed him due to being lost in thought. Kael handed him the medications, so Hajin could take some right away and hopefully improve his condition a little. Realizing that the angel had never bought medicine for anyone before, Hajin felt a certain pleasure in being the first person to have entered this home. Kael had even prepared lunch for him, and this unexpected display of care from such a person made it all the more special. The only thing that puzzled Hajin was the ointment Kael had bought. It wouldn't help with a cold, but it might relieve other consequences from the previous night. This embarrassed the young man, and he threw something at his housemate in mock frustration, but Kael deftly dodged it, already accustomed to his unusual reactions. Kael then told Hajin about his recent encounter with the stalker, casually discussing the man's unpleasant appearance while Hajin listened in horror. It became clear that, deep down, Hajin had wanted his tormentor to die, but he learned that the angel wouldn't go that far. Still, the stalker had permanently forgotten about him, meaning he would no longer be able to cause any trouble, even if they met on the street. Hajin found it hard to believe that it was truly over, that he was now finally free from the torment of his stalker. Once he realized it was real, a wave of happiness washed over him. He could now return to a normal life without fear. For the first time in a long while, Hajin smiled, and that expression deeply pleased the angel, who now had to figure out how to keep him from slipping away.